Right, so today we want to look at the Lord's arm. So many servants of God have been put through difficult situations. You and I, those in the past, those who will come in the future, have been put through difficult circumstances, trials. Right now, people are undergoing medical trials, bereavement. It could be financial. It could be at work. And what do? Sometimes we may feel that God isn't answering our prayers. However, God's timing isn't always in sync with our expectations. But we have to learn to keep on trusting Him and keeping the faith. We must have faith continuously despite our circumstances because God works in the background. And that's what I want to show today, that despite our circumstances, God is working in the background. So let's look at the first one of God's servants who God was working with. Joseph. Now we all know the example of Joseph and how he ended up in prison. And if we read Genesis 39 and 40, we would see that because of Joseph's faithfulness, he ended up in prison. And I am sure that Joseph thought that God wouldn't allow that to happen to him. Because Joseph left the smoking gun in Potiphar's wife's hand, the cloak, and he was being obedient to God. But in Genesis 39, verses 19 to 21, we see what happened. He was thrown into prison. And in researching this topic, the prisons in Egypt were horrible places. And most people who were put in prison had a limb cut off. Thankfully, that didn't happen to Joseph because God had a plan for him. In verse 21, we see that the Lord was with Joseph in the prison and showed him his faithful love. And the Lord made Joseph a favorite. So Joseph wasn't doing that for himself. God was doing it for him. And behind the scenes, God was working. Because God is the one who sent the two dreams to the cupbearer and the baker. And of course, we know it was God who gave Joseph the interpretation for the dreams. Again, Joseph's hopes were dashed. Because when the cupbearer went back to Pharaoh, you know what happened? He went back to his job. And the New Living Translation states, never given him another thought. I mean, that was hard. You got back your job. Someone interpreted your prayer, your dream, accurately, and you didn't give that person a thought. You know how devastated Joseph must have been and felt. But God was working in the background because eventually Pharaoh had a dream. And the only person who could have interpreted was Joseph. And eventually he was elevated to high office in the land. But God allowed him to experience jail before he rescued him. You know, God didn't have to allow him that. But I guess he was preparing him for that high position that he would hold, so that he would always be humble. What lesson we can learn from that? God was orchestrating the events. No one else was doing it. God was doing it in his timing. God allowed the dreams and he provided the interpretations. And the most important lesson from this is Joseph remained faithful and obedient to God throughout it all. We could think of another servant of God, Jeremiah. Jeremiah was put in jail. He was put in a pit where he was sinking. At that time, Jerusalem was under siege. People were starving. And even though he was rescued from the pit, he remained in prison until the siege ended. And we could look at this in Jeremiah 39, verse 6, and verses 9 to 14. But what did these events have that benefited Jeremiah? Because he was in jail and because he was in the pit and he was under house arrest after he came out, he did not try to flee as those in verse 6. Because those people who tried to flee, they were caught and slaughtered. And then we continue reading in verse 9. The captain of the guard, he took the exiles to Babylon. But what happened to Jeremiah? In verse 11, Nebuchadnezzar had told Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, to find Jeremiah. See that he isn't hurt. He said, look after him well and give him anything he wants. So despite being in jail, despite being in the pit, despite being under house arrest, God was working on the best for his servant in those difficult circumstances. And in verse 13 and 14, we see what happened. And eventually, he was freed and he enjoyed a good life, relatively good in the circumstances. While the others went to Babylon, they were exiled or killed. So what lessons we could learn from Jeremiah? God was working and orchestrating the events, even though he was in a difficult circumstance. God was working in the background. God allowed him to remain in the difficult situation, in jail or in the pit. And that eventually saved his life or saved him from being exiled. And the important lesson is Jeremiah remained faithful and obedient despite these circumstances. And you would think that a prophet like Jeremiah wouldn't have to go through things like these, but all God's servants, many of them had to go through some of these difficult circumstances. And God eventually changed the circumstance to their benefit. Now, we shouldn't go away from today thinking that all God's servants are rescued. John the Baptist was one servant that wasn't rescued. And John the Baptist was undergoing severe trials and was put in a difficult circumstance while Jesus was on earth. And I'm sure that he would have thought that Jesus is here, I will be freed. But you know what happened to John the Baptist? In verse 10 of Matthew 14, he was beheaded. A tragic death to undergo. Beheaded. And not only beheaded, after he was beheaded, verse 11, his head was brought in a platter in front of people to laugh and scoff at. And verse 12 tells us that John's disciples came for the body and buried it. And then they went to tell Jesus. And I'm sure they all had the expectation that, hey, Jesus is here. This one happened to John. He was a prophet. He baptized Jesus. So sometimes God doesn't rescue us from our difficult circumstance. Matthew 11:11 tells us that Jesus' words said that no greater man lived than John the Baptist. So from that we could infer God was working and orchestrating the event. Still, although John died a horrific death, God allowed him to remain in the difficult circumstance. But the third point is John remained faithful and obedient to the end. That's sobering thought of what happened. So what about us today in the church who undergo difficult circumstances, trials? Some of us have been undergoing bereavement, health issues, financial problems. What about us today? So I want to talk about David. Not the David you're thinking about. David from Vanuatu, a brethren in the church. And Vanuatu is a small group of islands just off the coast of Australia. We have a church there. I only learned about David from a prayer request that was sent to the Queensland church. I normally go to the services on Saturday night, and the prayer request was sent out on the site. And this was the prayer request. Your prayers are requested for David Tevimel. He's one of our brethren in Vanuatu living on Pentecost Island. He broke his leg and is in a very, very serious condition, having lost lots of blood. He has been sent to the hospital in Port Vila, and that is the main island of the archipelago. But after a couple of days, it's still in a critical condition. So that was December the 6th last year. And we all know what happened after. Anybody remember what happened after? December 17th, 2024. A 7.1 earthquake occurred just off Port Vila. People died. Buildings collapsed. In fact, the hospital he was in suffered damage while he was on a bed in the hospital. People had to come outside to seek treatment because they didn't want to remain inside the hospital. It was unsafe. So they moved the patients outside. So he was here in a critical condition. A 7.1 earthquake. Let's hear what happened afterwards. And the person speaking is Joe Rivers, the minister. Right. Mm-hmm.
In the setup today, but welcome to everybody listening online. And just as an update about Vanuatu, I don't know if you had a chance to read that, but I know everyone's been praying for David Tevimel that we've been talking about, who had a broken leg. He was on the island of Pentecost Island, which is a smaller island. There's actually no paved roads on that island. So apparently he was getting some supplies for a school, I believe, some children for school or something like that. And if you've been there in Vanuatu, when the soil there gets wet, it's really slippery. So somehow he managed to have I think we said a car, but I imagine it's a four-wheel drive, actually rolled onto his leg. So that's how his leg broke. And it was such a bad break that the bone pierced the skin. I think I mentioned this last week, where he lost a lot of blood. So they managed to get him to Port Vila, the main island where the hospital is. And some of his family members who live on Port Vila were able to donate blood because he lost so much blood in this injury, which kept him alive. However, the doctors in Vanuatu said, look, this is such a bad break, and you need surgery to have it repaired. There's just nothing we can do. You're going to have to just try to heal up. And he was so weak from the injury, he couldn't even feed himself, couldn't sit up in bed. It was not looking good. It wasn't looking like he was going to make it. But then the earthquake happened, which we've been announcing in the past few weeks. This massive earthquake hit Vanuatu, and Australia sent doctors over to Vanuatu to help in the aftermath. Well, these doctors got to the hospital in Port Vila. They saw David, and they said, oh, look, we can do that surgery to repair that leg. So they actually took him in. He went under surgery. We think it was a long surgery. I can't quite remember the details of that, but he had quite a long surgery to repair that leg. And after the surgery, he's recovering really well. He can feed himself now, has the energy to do that. They've put up a thing he can grab onto where he can pull himself up in bed. So all that's looking really positive. His prognosis has shifted from not great to looking like he's definitely going to recover. Not sure whether he'll be able to walk, but at least he's going to be able to survive this injury and likely through therapy be able to get back to life in Pentecost Island as well. So thanks the brethren over there wanted to thank everyone for their prayers. They definitely see God's hand in David's life and his ability to actually have the care that he needed through that earthquake. I know it's a horrible thing, but God works in mysterious ways, and as I say, God is good. They say that often as well. So just your thanks for the brethren in Vanuatu for your prayers, and they very much appreciate all that as well.
So I am sure when that earthquake happened, David probably said, it can't get any worse than this. I'm on bed. I can't help myself. He had to depend on people to take him out of the hospital, out of the ward, and return him. But God was working behind the scenes. If that earthquake didn't happen, no Australian doctor would have gone to Port Vila. And we see how God orchestrated the events for his servant. And this is a lesson for all of us. We may be in such a difficult circumstance, and things continue happening, and we're saying it can't get any worse. But once we have faith and hope in God, he is working behind the scenes. So what lessons can we learn today?
In the setup today, but
God works and orchestrates events behind the scenes. He does. We have to trust him. God allowed his servants to be in difficult situations. We saw that in the 4 examples. God allowed that. His timing may not be our timing. Joseph had to endure a further 2 years in jail when he thought he would have been freed, but that wasn't God's timing. The 4th point is God doesn't always rescue his servants from difficulties. John the Baptist, we too, Matthew 24 verse 9 and Revelation 20 verse 4 provides warning to us that some of us will be beheaded, some arrested, some persecuted, some killed, and many will be hated. But the 5th point we learn today is that God's servants remained faithful to the end. Even John the Baptist remained faithful to the end. And I want to end with this scripture, Isaiah 59:1, because it's a reminder that no matter the difficult situation, the arm of the Lord is not too short to save, nor his ear too dull to hear. And I'm sure that David in Vanuatu could testify to that. And we could from David's experience. Let's continue trusting in God.